2016, the Armenian General Benevolent Union, AGBU, has proudly been standing with the United Nations to highlight the issues of genocide, awareness, human rights, and refugee assistance. Our members across the globe have organized discussions, symposiums, and lectures, all with a shared purpose that focuses less on our own tragic history and more on what we are witnessing today. Our hope is that these forums, which explore the policies, their impact, and the interactions of governments, NGOs, and private citizens, will lead to much-needed collaboration and action by many stakeholders. As the largest Armenian philanthropic organization in the world, AGBU continues its 114-year history of driving conversations and impactful programming to support the global Armenian nation through cultural, educational, humanitarian, and socioeconomic development initiatives. In light of the ongoing uprisings sweeping over the region, this conference, Genocide, Freedom of Expression and Social Media, the Balance of the Unbalanced, will examine the role of freedom of expression in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Armenia. It will explore the international stance on freedom of expression vis-à-vis cases of its criminalization, producing hate content, and inciting to genocide using social media and other platforms. On behalf of the District Committee of AGBU Lebanon, I would like to thank the Issam Faris Foundation Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, the OHCHR, Facebook, the International Center for Human Sciences, UNESCO, SMACS, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Foundation of Human and Humanitarian Rights, Lepsius House Potsdam, and Lorient Le Jour for their collaboration. And now, I would like to invite the director of the Issam Faris Institute, Dr. Nasser Yassin. Dr. Yassin, the floor is yours.
Hi, good evening. This is the first event, I think, this semester, so we're practicing back to organizing those events. Of course, with the coronavirus, we have to be... It's a great pleasure to welcome you all this evening. This is, I think, the third collaboration we have with the AGBU. And we've been doing for 3 years very, fruitful collaboration on a very key subject for us here in the Institute and I think for AUB. In AUB, we haven't been engaging a lot on research on the subject of genocide, but I think we need to do more and more. But we in the Institute, this is a key issue for us, not only the subject of genocide, understanding it and trying to really highlight and raise the awareness to prevent any future genocide, but I think the whole subjects of this conference are very much interrelated and I see very much at the core of what we do. And what I'm going to say for a few words, so not to stop you from listening to the keynote speech and to the other interesting panels. When this subject was brought to us like a few years back with the AGBU, with colleagues, and we started discussing this, and we said this is very, very, very interesting. But one could say, and we expect, that the world should have moved from this. What we learned from these acts of extreme violence, these previous mayhem, and the agony that warlords have caused on a lot of millions of people, actually. During and after World War I, as we saw in the Armenian Genocide, World War II, and later in the 70s, in the 90s particularly, in places like Rwanda and Bosnia, one would say we learned from this mistake, and actually we haven't learned a lot. And we saw ourselves a couple of years back, we're just going through the same cycle of misery and mayhem and agony when we saw the Yazidis of Iraq were being treated like their brothers in humanity earlier in 1915 and later in the 1940s and so on. So actually this is very important for us in the Institute because we need to raise awareness and we need to learn, and hopefully we need to go in this long way to learn from those past experiences. And I think you know this, so I'm not going to add a lot, but this is just for the sake of introduction. But I want to delve into two tensions we face here as researchers in the Institute to two of the issues raised or were going to be raised in this conference. And the first one, how to counter hate speech. Of course, it could be seen as a matter of, rule of thumb. We need to just stand against it. Of course we do. And for years, we've been trying to debunk a lot of myth and wrong information and fake information, particularly when it comes to refugees in Lebanon and the region, particularly with the Syria crisis. We've been using a lot of facts. This is what we do. We produce evidence. We do knowledge production. This is our, job. And here is the tension. And here is the tension for us as academics and scholars in this field. Fake and fabricated news, exaggerated news, propaganda, they touch on false memories. This is what research is telling us. They work on actually forming false memories in order to affect the emotions and behaviors of those individuals that they are targeted with. This is what the propagandists work do. This is what politicians, many of those, populist politicians, this is what they do. They try to affect the fake memories and emotions. But what we do, and this is a tension for us, we actually work on facts and evidence. And these are not actually easy, to get into the emotions of people. They target logic. They target the logos rather than the pathos that some politicians are trying to do. And this is actually a tension that we need to address in this conference. How actually to upgrade our work, not to fall into sensationalism. We're not saying this at all, but how to upgrade the work we do as scholars and researchers to actually start to changing the attitudes and behaviors of people towards these good causes we work on. Refugees, countering myth, countering wrong information, and so on and so forth. And the second tension we have is, of course, not a tension of freedom of speech. A'udhu billah. Of course, we stand against any censorship. And this is actually what the academia is built on. This is the foundation of academic freedom. This is our value system, And there is actually a large degree of clarity about it. Yet, there are gray areas. And actually, colleagues who work on the content on social media know about this, Muhammad and other colleagues. There are gray areas that confuse us. And I'm actually want to highlight some of these issues here. They confuse us. I'm not talking about criticizing a politician. I'm not talking about criticizing a public figure or even insulting her or him. Whatever we saw in the last few months, that's fine. It's not about this. It's actually about the poisonous speeches that are touching on people's emotions, the things I mentioned before, the fake memories that actually are leading to more and more divisions in society and might lead into actually violence. How actually to stand against this? This is not an issue of, affecting the freedom of those people to express themselves. I think there's something more serious about which we need to discuss in this forum. And we need actually to look into those deniers. There are a lot of deniers with conspiracy theorists. We need to look into deniers, who deny that there was an Armenian genocide. We want to look into the deniers of the Nakba, and we're seeing now the repercussions of that yesterday. We want to look into the deniers of the Holocaust. These are key issues that we need to draw and build clear lines, party lines, as they say. I'm not talking about political party, but we need to have clear lines how to really tackle those deniers, how to really tackle those, gray areas that might actually, challenge us and create this tension for us when we deal with freedom of speech. I really don't have an answer. I have an answer for myself that I'm open to listen to any point of view, but actually we need to look into the accountability of such freedom of expression. What does it mean on those points I raised? And this is exactly what this forum is trying to tell us. And actually, this is exactly what some of the panels will try to tell us about, when there is a clear line of, black and white, and when actually we need to go into these gray areas. And I'm going to stop here and look really forward to listening to all these great panels in this program. And we're going to keep actually this collaboration going forever, every year, inshallah, with AGBU. And thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here today with us. And I want to also thank AGBU and Issam Fares Institute for organizing and hosting this event. I'm pleased to be here today. First of all, my name is Diana. I'm the Syria researcher at Amnesty International based in Beirut. I am pleased to be here with you today to discuss several issues that are more relevant than ever to the times we are witnessing in the Middle East region and beyond. These issues include the lack of accountability to several gross human rights violations, genocide, and other, including the rise of hate speech, as well as the oppression of freedom of expression. Our first speaker is Mr. Ulrich Holstein. He is the Deputy Regional Representative of the Regional Office for the Middle East and North Africa at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. He has worked in the field of international human rights for the past 20 years. Before joining the Regional Office for the Middle East and North Africa, he served as the acting chief of section at OHCHR Geneva, supporting the work of UN independent experts, special procedures of the Human Rights Council, conducting multiple human rights fact-finding missions, headed the Secretariat of the United Nations Forum and the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and served as an advisor on migration and human rights and on issues related to economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the human rights dimensions of poverty, the environment, and climate change.
I think someone is forgetting their phones, maybe. Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank the AGBU and the Issam Fares Institute for convening this conference on what is indeed one of the most important human rights questions we are struggling with today. And I will focus my comments on hate speech and on how the international human rights norms and standards can help combat it. As we know, extreme hate speech has in the past ignited violence that have conducted to genocide. And as was also mentioned, this is not only a matter of the past. And as we realize from multiple fact-finding missions also conducted by the UN, the risk of genocide is as real as it was in 1948 when the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were adopted. Now, concerning hate speech. So what do we mean by hate speech? Well, if you're a parent, you may think of children who are often quite skilled in calling each other bad things and getting into fights. Or you could also think of typical pre-election debates where politicians are very good at trading personal insults. But that's not really what we're talking about here. And I think a very good definition was given last year in the UN strategy and plan of action to combat hate speech. And that was launched by the Secretary General last year in June. And the strategy defines hate speech as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative, discriminatory language with reference to a person or group on the basis of who they are. In other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. And the key point to note here is that we're talking about hateful attacks against a person that is based on her or his identity, whereby the attack is also an attack on a broader or larger group of people. And hate speech has the effect of denigrating, dehumanizing an entire group of people, fueling fear, division, and this us versus them mentality. And it comes in many shapes and forms. And it can be less or more or less explicit and extreme, ranging from negative stereotyping and direct incitement to discrimination and violence. And it's on the increase. Last year, the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Secretary General sounded the alarm. And they were seeing an increase in the amplitude and dissemination of hate speech globally. And this concern was also echoed last year in September by a group of 30 UN human rights experts. And they expressed alarm that hate speech has become mainstream in all different political systems, is threatening democratic values, social stability and peace, and exacerbated societal and racial tensions, inciting attacks with deadly consequences around the world. And this surge in hate speech is linked to our access to new means of communication, which is in turn making the phenomenon more complex. So we have a multitude of social media platforms that allow for quicker and wider dissemination, often conceal the identity of the sender, and operates across borders and makes regulation difficult. And then on top of that, today effective regulation requires action not just by governments, but also by private companies that serve as the online intermediaries, such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. So how can human rights help address hate speech? I'm sure that all of us here can agree that hate speech is a bad thing and something that we should fight against. But when we look at it from a human rights perspective, it becomes clear that there are a number of pitfalls that we need to avoid. And I'll just give you one example. In the context, as you know, there's also protests going on in Algeria. And concerns have been raised over the past few months that we are seeing an upsurge in hate speech there. So the newly elected president have instructed that a bill be drafted to criminalize hate speech. And of course, it's not known what this law would be, but according to the official press statement that was issued, the law should allow the authorities to confront those who exploit the peaceful nature of the Iraq by using slogans that undermine national cohesion. So this initiative have sparked, as you can imagine, debate locally amongst those that back the initiative and those that are concerned that it could give a wide scope to crack down on legitimate protest. So the point here is that action to combat hate speech needs to be done in a way that does not undermine other human rights. So if we look into what the human rights treaties have to say, they actually don't use the term hate speech, but they define types of hateful speech that we all should be protected against. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its Article 7 says that all are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination and against any incitement to such discrimination. And this protection against discrimination is found in all of the 9 core international human rights treaties. And the protection against incitement is most clearly spelled out in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and in the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So on the one hand, states have an obligation to prohibit certain types of hateful speech, namely advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. At the same time, states must ensure that any such restriction, prohibition, comply with the strict criteria for permissible restrictions on the right to freedom of expression. And these permissible restrictions are quite limited. They're limited to those that they have to be provided by law and those that are necessary to respect the rights and reputations of others or to protect national security, public order, public health, or morals. And importantly, the burden falls on the authority restricting the freedom of speech to demonstrate its compatibility with that right, with the right to freedom of expression. So the Office of the High Commissioner has been convening a number of expert consultations around the world and bringing in human rights experts to discuss this issue. And one of these results has been the Rabat Plan of Action, which you may have heard of. So it seeks to provide further guidance on when hate speech would amount to a punishable offense. But it also gives further guidance about hate speech more generally. And one of the issues it points out is the importance of who actually pronounced the speech. So the position and status of the people who pronounced the hateful statement. And this underlines the role of public officials, religious leaders, media organizations. So they both have a very important responsibility in promoting a culture of tolerance and mutual respect. And at the same time, they can be a main detrimental force in legitimizing and propagating hateful speech. So let me sum up by saying that when we look at hate speech from a human rights perspective, a number of things become apparent. And one is the risk that measures to combat hate speech unduly restrict public freedoms. And for example, when companies that serve as these online intermediaries, they risk acting contrary to their corporate responsibility to respect human rights when under pressure to screen out content that is considered offensive. And another realization is that most of the hate speech we see today, and which would fall within the definition that I gave earlier of the UN strategy, do not amount to a punishable offense under international human rights law. But this does not mean that states and companies do not have to and do not have an obligation and responsibility to combat speech that foster a climate of discrimination and violence. But it means that other means than legal bans and censorship need to be pursued, such as, for example, education on pluralism and diversity. Or in some cases, you also have political parties having ethical guidelines on public speaking for their representatives. So here, in closing, the point is that hate speech does not meet the level of incitement to violence to be a human rights concern. And in fact, we really need to address it early on, exactly for the reason of preventing it from escalating into something which is of course far more dangerous. Thank you for your attention. So.
Thank you, Mr. Holstein. Our next speaker is Dr. Darina Saliba Abishdid, who will speak about whether the international system is able to control hate speech and incitement to genocide. Dr. Abishdid is the current director of the International Center for Human Sciences. She holds a PhD in public international law. Her areas of teaching include political science, international relations, international law, human rights and ethics at different universities in Paris and in France and in Lebanon. She is also a consultant in human rights and arbitration at Arab League-affiliated Cairo Regional Center for Training and Arbitration. Dr. Abishdid has given and prepared multiple trainings, workshops, and other academic activities, such as training of trainers with the United Nations World Youth Alliance Program in 2015, and at the International Criminal Court training at The Hague in 2016, among many others. The floor is yours.
Allow me first to thank AGBU and Isam Faris Institute for their invitation. I try to be brief and finish in 10 minutes. So I'll be talking about hate speech used as an incitement to genocide under international criminal law. First of all, criminalizing incitement to genocide has long generated disagreement among scholars and practitioners, as you know. So because, in fact, it is considered as a danger to the fundamental rights of, that is freedom of expression, as enshrined in human rights instruments. So it's difficult to identify incitement to genocide and distinguish it from other forms of inflammatory speech, including the forms of incitement that is codified by the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and I will come back later to this point. Including also political speech, because political speech can convey features of stereotyping, prejudice, falsehoods, generalization, and appeals to emotion and fear. But this still could be a legitimate non-criminal speech. So in order to prevent violence and protect freedom of expression at the same time, international law on incitement and other forms of criminal speech should be interpreted and applied with particular care and consistency. The question that remains is the following: how to limit incitement to genocide and other forms of inflammatory speech without inhibiting freedom of expression? I will not define again hate speech. Mr. Ulrich has already given a definition, but I will say that hate speech can have, or has, in fact, direct and indirect effects. The direct effect may directly offend, so the speech may directly offend or denigrate, humiliate, or frighten a person or a group of people. It purports to describe, such as when a racist shouts at a person of color. And this speech here constitutes an action, such as the action of offending. In the indirect effect of hate speech, the speech is intended primarily for another different audience, with the goal of causing that audience to share the views expressed or implied in the speech and motivate them to think and act against the victim group, for example, with hostility, discrimination, or violence. Here, the speech constitutes a reaction of offending. If we look at the origin of incitement to genocide, first, as you know, the definition or incitement to genocide definition is codified in a global treaty, that is the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. At Article 2, we find the definition of genocide as being a series of acts, including killing and serious crimes, serious bodily harm or mental harm, committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. So it criminalizes direct public incitement and also the intent of this crime. Okay, but causation here is not a requirement. It means that speech may constitute incitement to genocide, whether or not it is actually followed by the act of genocide itself. Okay, I'll come back to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966. At Article 20 of this covenant, in fact, they direct states, parties to prohibit 3 distinct acts or forms of incitement: incitement to discrimination, incitement to hostility, and incitement to violence, because of the damaging or disastrous indirect effects that it may have. And because there is international consensus that the law must suppress those effects. That's why, in fact, these 3 forms, together with the incitement to genocide, are distinct under international law, but also related in key ways. But we should note here that neither the ICCPR nor the Genocide Convention seeks to suppress hatred itself, nor even the expression of hatred. Both treaties seek to proscribe only certain effects or consequences of the expression of hatred. So that's why also in international law, so international law prohibits certain speech acts for their consequences, not for only the speech itself, so for their consequences. And because it would be impossible, in fact, to reach international consensus on intolerable content, since, you know, community norms vary greatly. Okay, now, under the international criminal tribunals, as you all know, we have ad hoc criminal tribunals, international criminal tribunals, and we have the permanent international criminal court that we have in The Hague. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide, established in Article 3 of the Genocide Convention that we just saw, is replicated again at Article 2, Paragraph 3.c of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, statute, Article 4.3c of the International Criminal Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia, ICTY statute, and Article 25.3e of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. But the ICTR is the only one where we find really an indictment or a case on incitement to genocide. For the ICTY, so for ex-Yugoslavia, it has prosecuted Vojislav Sasilj, who was accused of instigation and hate speech, so not incitement to genocide. Okay, why we are doing this distinction? Because instigation is different from incitement to genocide, as interpreted by these criminal tribunals. There is a difference, there is a difference also between direct and public incitement to genocide. Instigation, in accordance with the International Criminal Tribunal jurisprudence, is not an inchoate crime. It means it's not an incomplete crime that prepares for or seeks to commit another crime. But it is punishable only where it leads to the actual commission of an offense intended by the instigator. So here the consequences really matter. Okay, now I'll take as an example the case of Akayesu case with the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. You know, this tribunal has tried many cases and accepted several guilty players for incitement to genocide. One of the most notable cases is the Rwandan Akayesu case. In fact, briefly, Jean-Paul Akayesu, who was the mayor of the Rwandan township of Taba, was convicted by the ICTR for incitement to genocide, as well as for genocide. Early in the morning on April 19, 1994, he came upon a crowd of more than 100 people standing near the body of a young Hutu militiaman who had been killed. Akayesu gave a speech exhorting the crowd to unite against the sole enemy, which he described as the accomplices of the Tutsi rebels who had been fighting to overthrow the Hutu-led government of Rwanda. Akayesu's audience had understood his speech as a call to exterminate the Tutsi people. He knew that his speech would be understood that way, since genocide had already begun elsewhere in Rwanda, and genocidal militias had already formed in Taba. Hundreds of Tutsi were in fact killed in Taba in the days after Akayesu's speech. In September 1998, the tribunal convicted Akayesu not only for genocide, but also for direct and public incitement to genocide. So as you can see from this case, direct and public incitement to genocide have been interpreted differently. In this case, the ICTR emphasized the inchoate nature of the crime by declaring that genocide clearly falls within the category of crimes so serious that direct and public incitement to commit such a crime must be punished as such, even where such incitement failed to produce the result expected by the perpetrator. So when we consider as hate speech an international crime, hate speeches have often been associated with armed conflicts and ethnic cleansing and genocide occurring during these armed conflicts, so when we have wars or armed conflicts. The elements of this crime, we have talked about it, but briefly, so it should be direct, public, and we have also the intent to commit this crime, and the causation that is not really an element, because it does not follow that violence must actually result. So here, regardless of the consequences. In the incitement element, there are 4 features. First of all, we have to look at the purpose of the speech, whether there was violence that has resulted from it or not. The second feature, there should be a direct call for violence. And sometimes there is a twilight zone because we cannot recognize or we cannot really know whether it is a hate speech that is inciting to genocide or not. So that's why it will be very helpful to analyze the text. The third feature is the context. We should see whether there is an ongoing genocidal violence, as the case that we have seen with Rwanda, and the nature of the environment. And the fourth feature is we have to know that whether it is public or private, incitement to genocide, both are dangerous. There are three techniques in this incitement to genocide. What we call the glorification, which means to glorify past violence. For example, in the Rwandan Genocide, in addressing the population on Radio-Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, RTLM, the infamous Radio Machette announcer Georges Rogieu congratulated the valiant combatants who engaged in a battle against innocent Tutsi civilians. This was a glorification of genocidal violence. Another technique is what we call the accusation in the mirror. In this technique, we accuse, in fact, or the perpetrator accuse the victims of the very thing that he is doing. And this is an insidious technique that was also used in Rwanda. For example, in his speech, the Hutu extremist politician Léon Mugazera declared, "These people called Inyendi, which means cockroaches, thus also representing dehumanization, are now on their way to attack us. I am telling you, and I am not lying, it is they who want to exterminate us. They only want to exterminate us. They have no other aim. Are we really waiting till they come to exterminate us?" The third also and final technique is dehumanization. Here, they treat fellow human beings as though they are not human beings. And also in Rwanda, the extremist Hutus routinely dehumanize Tutsis by referring to them in their incitement as snakes, as cockroaches, and as rats. Finally, for this presentation, when do we know that really this incitement to genocide, or the speech, in fact, has culminated in a very dangerous speech, finishing or ending with an incitement to genocide? I will use what Suzanne Banish called the 6-point test, summarized by 6 questions. If you answer in affirmative to these questions, then we are really facing a very dangerous speech that can culminate in an incitement to genocide. These questions are the following. So, was the speech understood by its audience as a call to commit genocide? Was the speaker able to influence the audience, and was the audience able to commit genocide? Had the target group suffered recent violence? Was the audience suffering economic insecurity, so lacking in food, shelter, employment, especially in comparison with its recent past? Did the speaker dehumanize the target group and justify the killing? Had the audience already received similar messages? So if we answer yes to these questions, we are facing a very dangerous hate speech. And to conclude, I would say that the dangers of incitement, whether public or private, are tangible and undeniable. The presence of internet today and all the facilities, that spread inciting messages, they aggravate more the situation. The recent cases of genocide trials, whether for heads of states or states themselves, are considered a historic moment in international law. And even though these new developments in international law might not provide much deterrence, they may still provide at least some justice. And that is far, far better than anything we have had until now. And finally, I'll finish also with a word for UNESCO. The education we need to prevent genocide is not just about knowledge, but also about teaching and learning feelings and emotions. Empathy is what makes us a human, and it is the ultimate barrier against mass violence. Thank you.
Can I please ask the panelists to join me for our next panel? So in 2019, protests unraveled across the world, from the streets of Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, to Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, and Sudan, and Hong Kong. Protesters took the street to hold ministers and public officials accountable for their failure to provide very basic rights, basic economic and social rights. And through protests, especially in Lebanon and Iraq, people were able to reclaim public spaces. And by reclaiming public spaces, experts, scholars, activists, and many others were able to speak freely about various issues, creating spaces for people to engage in discussions and express their right of freedom of speech and expression. According to international human rights law, the right to freedom of speech and expression are both protected. And that includes shocking or offensive expressions against public figures, as long as it does not encourage discrimination based on race, gender, class, or other, and it does not incite to violence. So the question today is, what do we regulate? And who decides what could be regulated? And when does freedom of expression become hate speech? And how are government policies curtailing the right to freedom of expression and speech, or in some cases, or many cases, turning a blind eye to hate speech, except when it targets them? All of that is an attempt to normalize gross violations and genocide and to avoid accountability. In this panel, we will discuss the lessons learned in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Armenia. And we will start off with Aya Majzoub, who is the Lebanon and Bahrain researcher in the Middle East and North Africa division at Human Rights Watch. She investigates human rights violations in both countries. And over the past year, Aya's work in Lebanon has focused on the shrinking space for freedom of expression, particularly on social media. And prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Aya was the deputy head of digital investigations at the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, where she investigated war crimes in the Middle East and built criminal cases against high-level perpetrators implicated in the violation of international criminal and humanitarian law. Aya will be speaking about the research she conducted in Lebanon. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. And thank you very much for hosting us today for what's a very, very important discussion, especially in today's context in Lebanon. So as Diana mentioned, over the past year, I've been at Human Rights Watch documenting the shrinking space for freedom of expression in Lebanon. And we found that one of the key tools that public officials were using to go after their critics and to repress free speech were the country's criminal defamation laws, which in some cases authorize imprisonment for up to 3 years for peaceful speech. The defamation laws in Lebanon have often been used in conjunction with Lebanon's incitement laws, which also authorize imprisonment of up to 3 years. So defamation laws are intended to protect the honor and reputation of people, and they're distinct from incitement laws, which are intended to serve the purpose of maintaining order and to prohibit expression that's intended or likely to provoke crimes such as imminent violence or incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Now, these laws in Lebanon, the incitement laws and the defamation laws, have been on the books since the early 20th century. But one of our striking findings is that their use has been steadily increasing since we saw the trash protests in 2015, which demonstrated the prevalent discontent with the ruling party and with corruption and the mismanagement of public funds. But instead of committing to tackling corruption, the political elite responded to criticism against them and threat to the status quo with repression and politically motivated prosecutions, particularly targeting individuals who were leveling accusations of corruption against them. So the Cybercrimes Bureau, which is a unit within the internal security forces that's supposed to be combating cybercrime and enhancing online security, has been one of the main agencies that has been calling people in for investigation based on complaints of defamation and incitement, particularly on social media, but not limited to social media. And the numbers that they provided us with on the number of cases that they had investigated over the past few years were really, really striking. So the Bureau told us that between January 2015 and May 2019, they had investigated 3,599 defamation cases. And what was really striking was the rate at which these cases were increasing. So in 2015, the Bureau investigated 341 such cases. The number increased to 755 the year after that, 800 the year after that. And in 2018, the Bureau investigated 1,451 defamation cases, an increase of 81% from the previous year and 325% from 2015. Now, part of the explanation for this huge increase is, of course, politicians saw that these laws were working, and so they were learning from each other. But also 2018 was an election year, so we saw a huge spike in these prosecutions to silence criticism of politicians and public officials ahead of the elections. Today, despite the dire economic situation and despite millions of people taking to the streets to demand accountability for corruption, we've seen politicians resort to the same tricks that they used after 2015, and we've seen them again weaponize Lebanon's criminal defamation and incitement laws to intimidate and silence their critics. Now, of course, almost all states have some form of defamation law that individuals can resort to if they feel like their reputations have been unfairly damaged. And almost all states also have incitement laws to maintain public order. However, Lebanon's laws are vague and overbroad, and they don't comply with Lebanon's obligations under international law. So I'll start first with Lebanon's incitement laws. So as Mr. Ulrich mentioned, properly framed, incitement and hate speech laws are one of the very few permissible criminal restrictions on the right to free speech. Yet, such laws must also satisfy a number of conditions so that they can strike a proper balance between the individual's right to free speech and the state's obligation to safeguard the rights of others. So, for example, under international standards, governments can only punish statements in the name of national security if A, the expression is intended to incite imminent violence, B, it's likely to incite such violence, and C, there's a direct and immediate connection between the expression and the likelihood or the occurrence of the violence. However, Lebanon's laws don't conform with these standards. So Article 317 of the Penal Code punishes any acts or words, spoken or written, that are intending or resulting in instigating sectarian or racial strife, or that provoke conflict between the sects by 1 to 3 years imprisonment. However, the provision doesn't specify what sectarian or racial strife entails, nor does it require that the speech be likely to, or even intended to, incite discrimination, hostility, or violence. A law that's so vague that individuals don't know what expression may constitute, what expression may violate it, has a chilling impact on free speech because citizens may avoid discussing any subject that they fear might subject them to prosecution. And under international law, if a criminal law is not so clearly defined so that anyone can predict what constitutes a crime, it would be arbitrary. And we've documented in Lebanon some pretty bizarre uses of Article 317. So for example, a political analyst who criticized the head of a political party was accused of defaming that individual, but also of inciting sectarian tensions, just because he criticized the head of a political party. And then in another case, a person who criticized general security was also accused of inciting sectarian tensions, as if acknowledging that the institution belongs to a sect. So for these reasons, we've really recommended that Lebanon reform Article 317 so that it's consistent with its obligations under international law. And now the second category of laws that I'm going to speak about briefly is Lebanon's defamation laws, which are also very problematic and don't comply with international law. So first of all, they're criminal laws, which means that individuals may file a claim alleging defamation with the police, and then the police and the prosecutors will use public funds in order to investigate the case on behalf of the state. The courts can punish those found guilty of defamation by fines, but even imprisonment because it's a criminal offense. The criminal courts have issued prison sentences against at least 3 individuals in defamation cases between 2015 and 2019. One of those individuals actually received 9 prison sentences in 9 different criminal cases filed against him by the same politician. The Publications Court, which is specialized in what they call publishing crimes, has also sentenced at least 1 journalist to prison in absentia for speech that was deemed to be defamatory towards a certain political party. The second problem with Lebanon's defamation laws is that truth is not a defense in all cases. So people can be prosecuted and sentenced to jail, even if what they said about somebody was true. Third, public officials have special protection from defamation. So the penalties for defaming public officials in Lebanon are higher than they are for defaming individual citizens, even though there's more of a public interest in criticizing public officials and authorities. And finally, Lebanese law allows civilians to be tried in military courts if the alleged defamatory content was directed at any member of the military institution. So between October 2016 and March 2019, we documented at least 18 defamation cases filed by the military prosecutor. And charges included harming the reputation of the military institution, publishing comments that are offensive to the military institution and the army commander. And during the same time period, the military courts issued 3 in absentia prison sentences against journalists for comment that were deemed to be defamatory towards the military institution. Now, in one particularly outrageous case in 2015, a woman who alleged that she was raped by members of the army was then sued by the army for defaming the army, and she was tried in military court. Therefore, Lebanon's criminal defamation and incitement laws are themselves outdated and overbroad. But what's even more troubling is that we've documented that all of the authorities involved, from the security agencies doing the investigations to the public prosecution who issues the orders for arrest to the judiciary, were all behaving in ways that suggested that they were biased in favor of the powerful individuals who had filed the defamation lawsuits. So people that we interviewed described physical and psychological interrogation tactics that they believed were intended to humiliate and punish them and deter them from criticizing powerful people in the future. And I'll stop there because I know that my colleague is going to talk more about some of the effects of interrogation and the criminal process that we've documented in Lebanon.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aya. So our next speaker is Alexei Touma. He is a researcher with the Civil Society Actors and Policy Making in the Arab World program at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. He is currently working on a project mapping 92 case studies in 12 different Arab countries, and he has worked in journalism, political consulting, and security research.
Thanks, Diana. Thank you, IFI. Special thanks to the comms team and AGBU. And what I hope to present right now will complement what my colleague Aya has also talked to us about. So we at the Civil Society Actors and Policymaking Program at IFI have been working on this for a little under a year, and it resulted in us writing a policy brief and a case study on the topic in which we focused on the policy element, but also we zoomed in on the civil society actors aspect of it all. So just a bit about the methodology and the research. We focused a lot on desk reviews, interviews with the civil society organizations that are active on the ground, interviews with interrogated persons, as well as we held a policy dialogue at the center here, the Institute, that was attended by members of parliament, representatives of the internal security forces, media, civil society, and international organizations as well. So freedom of expression violations, in particular related to social media, have increased in the region since the Arab Spring, and Lebanon is following in their footsteps, despite protecting freedom of expression under Article 13 of the Constitution and being a party to several international agreements, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant for Protecting Civil and Political Liberties. So from 2017 onwards, 2017, there's been an increasing trend to summon and interrogate these individuals regarding freedom of expression cases. So the complaints tend to generate from political affiliates, political figures and their affiliates, or even religious figures and institutions. So this in itself represents a show of force against outspoken critics and activists. So the procedure, as Aya also briefly outlined, is that the complaint is usually filed to the public prosecutor, which then goes on to a security agency, which most commonly goes to the Cybercrimes Bureau. The Cybercrimes Bureau then calls someone in, and then that's where different accounts report different things, but they all kind of revolve around intimidation one way or the other, which I will further elaborate on shortly. So these actions in itself, these interrogations, have left Lebanon lacking a public debate on what it means to have freedom of expression in Lebanon, in the Lebanese context. And this in itself gives way for more violations and deprivation of rights to occur. So civil society organizations, which I'll refer to as CSOs, such as SKYS, Legal Agenda, Elif, SMEX, Maharat Foundation, and the Lebanese Center for Human Rights, just to name a few, have been collecting data on the government's use of legislation to punish journalists, activists, and other individuals as well. So in our policy brief, we focused on several different themes. One of the main ones was Lebanon's legal and judicial system. For instance, there has been reports of intimidation during interrogations, but it's clearly stipulated in Article 47 of the Lebanese Code of Criminal Procedure that if someone refuses to speak and remains silent, they must not be forced to speak, nor should the interrogation continue. Also, judges lack the proper training to handle cases that are directly related to digital spaces and social media. This challenges the adequacy of the judicial system's ability to handle cases related to freedom of expression. Another key theme is the role of the security services and the Cybercrimes Bureau as tools of suppression. The Bureau is reported to be coercive in their interrogations, and I'll say some examples. So, they're known to have, or it's reported to have been, that they've pressured individuals to sign pledges to refrain from speaking about certain subjects or figures. They've also detained individuals, and these detentions have lasted hours or even days. The individuals were denied lawyers, their phones were searched through without a warrant or a judge authority from a judge, and the use of excessive force. Another key theme is the political influence. So there's an undeniable pressure that is being exerted by politicians and the ruling class upon lawmaking and the judiciary. This is reflected by the red lines of freedom of expression in Lebanon that revolve around political, religious, and sectarian sensitivities. So among these things include the army, the flag, anything deemed to be a national symbol. It could be a cedar tree. And the president of the republic, for example. These are some of the main ones, the red lines. So CSOs have met reluctance and oftentimes disinterest from policymakers, despite some MPs' genuine efforts to pass modern laws on freedom of expression. The last theme revolves around civil society's actors that dedicate their work to the defense of freedom of expression. So they focus mostly on monitoring violations, raising awareness, and protecting persons under threat. Sadly, these efforts have not been enough to produce a change at the policy level, primarily due to a lack of political will and intent, and a lack of, could be relevant, international pressure as well. So the lack of funding for these civil society organizations has also had a significant impact on the roles that they can play in providing safety training or legal aid to individuals that have been affected or interrogated. There's a lack of significant public debate on this in Lebanon. And on this front, many non-traditional media outlets, particularly social media and online media, non-traditional is anything that's not what we see on TV that's affiliated with the ruling class. So I think we all know those, LBC, MTV, so on. So these media outlets, the non-traditional ones, have been reporting the handling of these cases by the state. And they're kind of leading the way in the media advocacy for these cases. I'd like to conclude by listing a few recommendations that we listed in our policy brief. So, of course, it is essential to have reforms on the media law, publication law, and the penal and civil codes, focusing on safeguarding freedom of expression. Some of these could be as simple as shifting defamation from the penal code to the civil code, to be handled in civil courts and not be treated as a crime. Also, clear definitions of what constitutes defamations, libel, and slander are needed. As I elaborated on, these definitions aren't very clear. Number two, train the judiciary on digital and freedom of expression matters to ensure the relevant competency when handling these cases. The security bodies such as Cybercrimes Bureau need to have their powers and scope more precisely defined. They need to reduce the role of the security services in these cases and limit interrogations and put an end to coercive measures and pre-trial detentions. CSOs are also encouraged to sustain and extend their efforts in safeguarding freedom of expression. They can help form a social understanding in Lebanon of what a freedom of expression means and also how it differs from hate speech. To conclude, the final recommendation is that the international community can play a role by aiding CSOs with funding, but also by suggesting special training to security forces, lawyers, and judges as a prerequisite for new grants or funding. And thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Our next speaker, Dr. Salma Al-Haj, who will be covering Iraq. She is a reporter, editor, and an anchor. She holds a PhD in anti-terrorism role of media. She has given and prepared multiple trainings and workshops at DR newspaper, AMB TV, Al Jadid TV, and the Iraq Amman network. She has worked with Al Mayadeen TV as a war correspondent in Iraq, covering Mosul liberation war from ISIS. Salma. Okay. So Salma will be speaking in Arabic, if you would need translation. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. مساء الخير. احتراما لهذا البلد العربي لبنان سأتحدث بالعربية، وإن كان الأصل فينيقي لا خلاف، لكن سأتحدث في العربية. وبما أنه سأتحدث أيضا عن اليمن كبلد عربي، يشرفني أن أتحدث باللغة العربية مع احترامي للجميع، لجميع الثقافات وجميع اللغات وجميع الحضور. لن أطيل، سأتحدث في 8 دقائق هكذا أخبرت، وهذه أيضا تندرج 8 دقائق وتحديد الوقت ضمن الإبادة الإعلامية إن صح التعبير. هذا اضطهاد إعلامي. بكل الأحوال لن أطيل، سأتحدث من خلال تجربتي في الموصل، تغطيتي لحرب الموصل وتحرير الموصل. على أكثر من مرحلة شاركت في تغطية هذه الحرب. الموصل سيكون كنموذج سنجار ونينوى أيضا. كان هناك إبادة جماعية بحق الأيزيديين، الككائيين، المسيحيين، ولا أحبذ استخدام كلمة الأقليات بقدر ما هي مكونات المجتمع العراقي. لذلك هذه الإبادة التي حدثت، وهذه في المكان القريب، الكل يتذكر إجرام داعش، الكل يتذكر، وإن كانت ذاكرة العرب في بعض الأحيان كذاكرة السمك، لكن هذه المشاهد الإجرامية حاضرة وماثلة أمامنا جميعا من دون استثناء. لذلك هذه التجربة سأحاول من خلال تواجدي على الجبهة في الخط الأمامي، خط الصد الأمامي إلى جانب الشرطة الاتحادية في العراق، ما الذي رأيته وما الذي تعرضنا له، وما هي الأرقام. لدي أرقام سواء مصدرها من الأمم المتحدة أو حتى من مفوضية حقوق الإنسان في العراق أو حتى للشرطة الاتحادية. الأخطر في أمر الإبادة بأنها قد تكون كحرب مفاجئة، ليس بالضرورة أن يكون هناك حرب. الحرب لها استعدادات، لها يعني حشد لهذه الحرب سياسي وإعلامي واقتصادي والتهويل الإعلامي إن أردنا. لكن أن تكون الإبادة في زمن السلم، وهذا ما حدث مع الأيزيديين. بعض الفتيات قالت لي من خلال إجراء التحقيقات الميدانية على الأرض بأنه داعش لن يأتي إلينا، نحن أشخاص مسالمين، لماذا يأتي داعش إلينا؟ إلى هذه الدرجة كان استبعاد لفكرة أن يأتي داعش إلى ويصعد إلى جبال سنجار. نعلم ما هو حجم الدمار، ليس فقط كحجر، وإنما كحجر وبشر، من سبايا، من استرقاق، من استعباد، من اضطهاد، من تفجير، من قتل جماعي للأطفال والنساء والرجال تحديداً. حتى هذه اللحظة في أيزيديات لا يزلن في إدلب. البعض تم تسفيرهن إلى ألمانيا بعد هروبهن من إدلب. البعض لقي حتفه من خلال قرارة نفسه. لأنه المجتمع الأيزيدي مجتمع جدا محافظ، كان من الصعب جدا أن يقبل الأهل أو هذه العشيرة بين مزدوجين أو حتى هؤلاء الفتيات على أنفسهن أن يكونوا قد تعرضوا للاغتصاب الجماعي من قبل المنظمة الإرهابية داعش. البعض منهن كان في أحشائهن أطفال، فضلوا أن يقتلوا أنفسهم وأطفالهم في داخلهم، والبعض تم تبنيه باعتبار الدستور أو القانون العراقي يعتبر بأنه كل من يتم أو يولد لقيط بهذا المعنى سيولد مسلما إلى حين يتم سن البلوغ ويختار. هذه الإبادة الجماعية في سنجار إلى حد اليوم هناك معاناة. نعم، هناك كثير من المواثيق، دائما نستنكر ودائما بيانات شجب واستنكار، ونحث على ضبط النفس، وهذا من المجتمع الدولي ومن المسؤولين والقيمين، لكن على الأرض أين هي المواثيق الدولية؟ كيف تم تطبيقها؟ أتحدث من خلال تجربة، وهذه التجربة لا تقتصر فقط على العراق، هو نفسه ما حدث في سوريا، وهو نفسه ما كاد أن يحدث في لبنان، وهو نفسه يحدث في اليمن وفي ليبيا. بكل الأحوال للإعلام دور جدا كبير. داعش قد تفوق علينا إعلاميا، وهذه للأمانة حتى لو كان داعش عدو سنعترف بقدراته الإعلامية، تحديدا من خلال السوشيال ميديا. السوشيال ميديا في عصرنا هذا يبحث عن تغيير موازين القوى. أنا أرفض شخصيا، لست كإعلامية، ولكن أرفض شخصيا أن يقال بأنه الإعلام هو السلطة الرابعة. لا، الإعلام هو السلطة الأولى، وعلى مدى السنوات الماضية القليلة نتذكر كيف ساهم الإعلام من قنوات فضائية ومن فيسبوك وشهود عيان، ساهم في صناعة، سموها ما شئتم، ثورات عربية، ربيع عربي، لن نختلف على هذه التسمية، لكن الإعلام هو السلطة الأولى في زماننا هذا، وليس الإعلام التقليدي كراديو وتلفزيون ومواقع إلكترونية، إنما نتحدث عن إعلام سوشيال ميديا بكل وسائلها على الإنترنت. طبعا للأديان دور يا أبونا، للأديان دور. لم يعد الآن الاستقطاب من أجل تنفيذ التطرف والإبادة الجماعية من خلال المساجد والجامعات والظلام، لا لا لا، كله عبر الإنترنت وكله واضح. والغريب بأنه هذه المواقع يتم إقفالها ويتم أيضا إنشاء بدلا منها في دقائق. كيف لا؟ هل يعقل بأنه يصعب على المجتمع الدولي ملاحقة هؤلاء من خلال جوجل ومن خلال فيسبوك وتويتر وكل السوشيال ميديا، وملاحقة هؤلاء كي نحد من هذا التطرف، كي نكون بأمن استباقي إلكتروني؟ هذا أيضا محط سؤال. حين يقول داعش الجهاد الإعلامي يساوي إن لم يكن أكبر من الجهاد العسكري، كان لدى داعش هذه المقولة الجهاد الإعلامي. لداعش استراتيجية أكثر منها مركزية بطبيعة الحال. هذه الهزيمة العسكرية التي تجلت منذ سنوات أو منذ سنة أو سنة ونصف تقريبا بشكل واضح بدأت تتحول إلى أن التنظيم فكرة لا يحتاج إلى أرض ليكون موجودا. ففي العام 2015 وبعد سيطرة المقاتلين الأكراد، اسمحوا لي أن أذهب إلى سوريا ولو كنت أنا سأتحدث عن العراق، على كوباني أي عين العرب بالعربية، قال المتحدث باسم التنظيم أبو محمود العدناني: هنيئا لك أيها البنتاغون، كانوا يخاطب الأمريكي، لهذا النصر لقد كسبت أكواما من الحجارة. ولهذا دلائل أنه المعركة ليست في الأرض وليست في مكان محدد، المعركة أصبحت خارج الفضاء المحدود الذي عرفناه تقليديا. هناك ترسانة إعلامية لداعش بكل ما الكلمة من معنى، شبكة عنكبوتية، مدونات، منتديات، مواقع إلكترونية تقليدية، يملك العديد من المؤسسات الإنتاج المرئي والصوري، لديه مواقع متغيرة وثابتة. هذه المواقع تتبدل روابطها باستمرار كما ذكرنا لتلافي الملاحقة والإغلاق. توفر هذه الترسانة خدمات بلغات عدة إلى جانب العربية والإنجليزية والفرنسية والتركية والشيشانية والكردية. يمتلك مجلات، إصدارات، إذاعات محلية، أبرزها إذاعة البيان التي كنا نستمع إليها في الموصل لنعرف ما الذي يريده. أحيانا كان يبث الأكاذيب، هناك حرب نفسية كانت جدا واضحة، يقول أن قام هناك انتحاري. وبالمناسبة أول 10 دقائق كانت لي في الموصل كفريق قناة الميادين مع مع مجموعة كانت كبيرة. تعرضنا لسيارة مفخخة من انتحاري كان يقودها، كان هناك شهداء من الشرطة الاتحادية. هذه الإذاعة البيان في شمال الموصل تلعب على الوتر النفسي والوتر العقلي. انتهى الوقت صحيح؟ قلت لك هذه إبادة. النقاط الإعلامية، هذه الترسانة الإعلامية. في المقابل سأختصر، في المقابل كان هناك الإعلام، كيفية التعاطي مع الإعلام العربي للأسف. هذه البنية المهترئة اسمحوا لي أن أقول لها، وهذا يؤسفني، أنا عربية وأنا لبنانية وأصلي فينيقي أيضا، لكن جدا أتأسف بأن يكون هذا الأسلوب البيروقراطي في وقت مثل ما بنقول كبسة الأون أوف. نستطيع أن نتحكم في أي بلد من البلدان، نستطيع أن نوصل الرسالة من بلد إلى آخر في أقل من الثانية بتغريدة واحدة. نستطيع أن نغير، نقيم حرب وسلم وإلى ما هنالك، ولا زلنا نريد أن نأخذ هذه الموافقات والإجراءات التي تطول قائمتها وهي كالحشو بكل صراحة. فقط اسمحي لي بأن هناك العديد من الصحفيين، نتحدث عن أكثر من 34 مراسلا ومصورا صحفيا، اختطاف أكثر من 27 بعد سيطرة تنظيم داعش. أيضا هناك في التحالف الدولي، هذه لابد من تمريرها. التحالف الدولي كان يتواجد، والغريب بأنه أكثر من تحالف من أكثر من 60 دولة لم يستطع القضاء على داعش. هذا مبحث آخر ومبحث سياسي بالدرجة الأولى. هذه القطاعات العسكرية كانت تتواجد، كان يمنع علينا من قبل الإعلام العراقي وتحديدا من قبل الحكومة العراقية، كان يمنع علينا أن نقول بأنه الأمريكي يتواجد معنا. هؤلاء كمستشارين، يا أخي كمستشارين ما الذي يفعلونه على خط الصد الأول إلى جانب الشرطة الاتحادية؟ ولماذا الشرطة الاتحادية تتعرض أيضا لقصف؟ نحن كإعلام نعم تعرضنا لقصف من قبل التحالف الدولي في الموصل، وكانت أن تحدث مجزرة لأنه كنا فريق إعلامي عربي وأجنبي يتواجد في مبنى واحد. كان التحالف الدولي يقصف، وفي نهاية التحرير في 8 تموز أخيراً في 8 تموز كان هناك دور للأمريكي بأن يقوم للأسف بتهريب، وهذه وثائق موجودة لدى الأمن العراقي، جماعة من داعش. هل هذه هي صندوق أسود؟ أبو منصور البغدادي هو صندوق أسود؟ هل تم قتله؟ هل إخفاؤه؟ أصلاً لا نعرف إذا كان أبو بكر البغدادي قتل أو لا. بكل الأحوال شكراً جزيلاً لكم، شكراً على هذا الحضور. كل ما نتمناه الخير لكل بلداننا، وأنا شعاري بعيداً عن المناطقية والقوقعة في مكان ما، أنا مع الإنسان في كل مكان. شكراً جزيلاً.
شكراً دكتور الحاج. بس بدي أذكر إنه في ريسبشن بعد ما نخلص البانلز، وكمان إذا حدا عنده بعد المزيد من الأسئلة كمان بيقدر يحكي مع دكتور الحاج. Our next speaker is Dr. Dolph Haasvelt, and he is a freelance writer and historian, as well as the academic director of the Potsdam Lepsius House, an institute in genocide research. He has published numerous books. His biography of Karl Marx, titled Karl Marx, an Intellectual Biography, published in 2013, has been awarded with the prize, The Political Book, by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in 2010. And his biography of Heinrich Heine interprets the author as an European intellectual. Over to you.
So, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here for the second time. First time I was here was in, I think, 3 years ago. I was asked again to speak about some subjects which are not so contemporary, they are more in the past and go into history, but still I think if you treat and see what happened with the Armenians during the First World War and the time after the First World War, because it was something like a negative model, still says a lot to us today, still. I will not answer not go into the question whether there had been a genocide or whether you can qualify this as a genocide. I've been speaking about this at several occasions also in this hall. I think this is without doubt. But as to the topics of this conference, I will concentrate myself on 2 or 3 questions or topics. The first concerns how to create public opinion and how to justify measures like genocidal measures in the framework what happened during the First World War. The second is where comes or what came and still comes the dedication to violent solutions from. And the third one will touch the ideological backgrounds, at least some of them. So that's very briefly, I've not so much time. But it is interesting to see, and that's why I have put this quotation at the beginning of my talk. Yes, is this better? Okay, thank you. This is a quotation from Henry Riggs. He was a Protestant missionary. He was born in today's Anatolia, and so he knew the country very well. And after the World War, he wrote his remembrances to what he saw in Harput in central Anatolia today. There was no animosity or religious fanatism evident at the beginning of the war. And when the storm finally broke out, that means 1915, we, who were living in the midst of it, realized clearly that this was no popular outbreak. So it was something which had been produced in a way, and the same judgment goes to Johannes Lepsius, who wrote the first documentation of the Armenian genocide in the fall of 1915. The destruction of the Armenians was executed top down on the administrative path, and this marked a difference to the massacres of 1894 to 1896, which were instigated by the incitement of the population. I will not go so much deeper in it, but the difference is that this was during the First World War, a state executed, or better to say, a genocide executed by half-state institutions. If you look at the documents from that time, you can see the way how the method of producing an atmosphere of justifying what was done worked. It always goes to the question of the Armenians plan an uprising. And as a proof of this, you can reconstruct how it began with the imprisonment of Armenian intellectuals, of Armenian priests, and so on. And under torture, there were confessions made, which have been published then as truth. So this was one of the methods to convince the population that what the government did was correct. And then also something what we today would like to call something like fake news. I mean, they produced, for example, photographs of uprisings which were not existing. They were just put into scene by something like by others. Now, all this has an ideological background, and let's come to my second point, the commitment to violence. The quotation here is from an early article in a Young Turk magazine called Osmanli, which was published in Paris in the late 19th century. A society is like a human body because each is composed of varied and numerous living cells. Just as an individual requires therapy to recover from illness, so society needs to take cures of its special illnesses. So one cannot say this is something like an incitement to genocide already, but it shows the mindset which began to develop in that time, that the society is seen in terms of medical metaphors, and this is easy, an easy way to dehumanize what happens when conflicts take place in a society. You compare them to illness, and you compare the microbes which cause the illness as the enemies which have to be eradicated. This way of thinking was very, very popular in the Young Turk movement. It was very popular then later among the National Socialists in Germany also, because it is easy to combine this with the racist view of society as well. Another thing is modern nationalism. Zia Gökalp was something like the chief ideologue of the Committee of Union and Progress, the so-called Radical Young Turks, and he was the one who influenced the radical faction of the Young Turks within the First World War, as well as Ataturk after the war. So there is also part of the continuity between this radical policy within the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey. So there can be no real common home and fatherland for diverse people. A nation is not a voluntary, it's an association like a political party which man may join at his own volition. And the consequence is, who does not belong to this common home must be separated in the one or the other way, either expelled or the radical solution is genocidal. And they knew it. I mean, to give this proof, no, I have only 2 minutes left. So, come to this. They knew it and they openly spoke about it. So at the CUP Committee of Union and Progress Party Congress in 1916, this is the quotation: the policies of the unity of diverse elements of the populace, that means the Ottoman multi-ethnicism, multi-religious society, has run into bankruptcy and has opened an era of cleansing. They literally called it what they did themselves, an era of cleansing in our fatherland. Coming to a conclusion, Hans Kohn, one of the great nationalists of historians of nationalism in the East, 2 courses were open to the Young Turks. They could transform Turkey into a decentralized state of composite nationality and offering to its various people free autonomy and the opportunity of fulfilling their national aspirations. Or they could attempt to subdue the other peoples by force and so erect a predominantly Turkish empire or better nation state. And the Young Turks choose the second solution. So to end with this, in conflict situations, you always have a choice. You can either go the way of negotiating, of mediation, of finding a social contract, or you go the way of violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Our next speaker is Samia Al-Aghbari. and she is a Yemeni journalist and a human rights activist. She was one of the leaders of the protests against the traditional gender roles of women in Yemen and served as the secretary of the Rights and Freedoms Committee of the Journalist Syndicate in Yemen. She has worked with the Arab Network of Human Rights in Egypt and Reporters Without Borders in Paris. Honored by the American Islamic Congress and the Yemeni Organization for the Promotion of Integrity. She has participated and prepared trainings and workshops in the field of human rights, journalism, anti-corruption, and transparency. And Samia will be speaking in Arabic as well.
مساء الخير. طبعا أنا يفترض أن أقدم عرض النماذج لهذا الخطاب التحريضي من اليمن، ولكن قبل عرض النماذج سأتحدث بعض الملاحظات. أن هذا الخطاب التحريضي في اليمن ليس وليد اليوم وليس وليد الحرب الأهلية. نبذ الآخر وتخوينه وتحقيره وإقصاؤه موجود في اليمن منذ ما قبل الحرب كأي بلد. هل اشتعال الحرب الأهلية زاده اشتعالا أم أن الحرب هي من زادت من حدته؟ المهم أصبح من الطبيعي أن تقرأ أو تسمع وتشاهد في وسائل الإعلام ومواقع التواصل الاجتماعي مصطلحات كداعشي، كانفصالي، كافر، دحباشي، علماني، اشتراكي، ملحد، مرتزق، هاشمي، متورد، مزين، مجوس، روافض، مصطلحات كثيرة ربما لن يفهمها سوى اليمنيون. كان هناك مصطلح سياسي هو الهضبة، كانت الهضبة مجرد مصطلح جغرافي سياسي، الآن أصبح مصطلح تحقيري مناطقي لبعض أبناء المناطق أو المحافظات في الجمهورية اليمنية. هذا الخطاب المثير للنعرات المناطقية والطائفية والعنصرية للأسف يشارك فيه غالبية المثقفين اليمنيين، صحفيون وناشطون ورجال الدين وشخصيات معروفة، ومنهم من لديهم مناصب عليا في الدولة، وغالبا ما يتغير طبعا الخطاب حسب تغير التحالفات المحلية والأقليمية، وطبعا حسب الممول. أغلب ما سيتم بثه من فيديوهات، لا أعتذر عن رداءة الصورة ربما، لكن جميعها وليس أغلبها هي لصحفيون وناشطون وشخصيات ورموز دينية معروفة في اليمن وليست أسماء وهمية. المهم طبعا في اليمن بدلا من انتقاد الفعل أو جريمة الشخص يتم معايرته بفقره وشكله وبيئته التي عاش فيها، وإن كان لديه إصابة جسدية فبإصابة جسده. خادم، أعرج، أعور، بائع القاتل الذي أصبح رئيسا. إبان الثورة اليمنية أخرج علي عبد الله صالح من قبيلة آل الأحمر الكبيرة ليصبح لقبه عفاش كانتقاص من أسرته. يقولون كانت والدته تبيع القهوة، وكأن مشكلتنا كانت مع والدته وفقر والدته. لا يتم التفريق بين النقد السياسي ونقد ممارسات وانتهاكات وجرائم جماعة ما وبين ممارسة العنصرية تجاهها واستهدافها كعرق أو سلالة. كل خطاب طبعا وله جمهوره في مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي وخصوصا فيسبوك عالم مفتوح بدون ضوابط، أصبح منصة لنشر الشائعات وللتشهير والتحريض ولمن أراد الشهرة على حساب كرامة وسمعة وأمن الآخرين بسبب منشور أو مقال أو فيديو تحريضي بين ليلة وضحاها يتحول أحدهم من شخص مغمور ليس لديه أي متابع وليس لديه أي نشاط إلى نجم يتابعه الآلاف. كما أن مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي أصبحت توجه بعض وسائل الإعلام الكبرى ومصدر معلومات لها. تتعدد منابر التحريض، فليست سوى وسائل الإعلام ومواقع التواصل الاجتماعي وحدها أدوات التحريض، بل هناك منبر آخر وهو منبر خطير أيضا، المسجد ودورات التثقيف التي تقوم بها جماعات دينية طائفية. وهذه الخطب والدورات تحرض وتكفر وتخون الآخر ومنظمات المجتمع المدني والناشطين المدنيون والنساء المنخرطات في العمل العام. هم من المستهدفين من هذا الخطاب، ولعل الموظف في الصليب الأحمر اللبنانية الجنسية حنا لحود الذي قتل في مدينة تعز عام 2018 هو ضحية هذا الخطاب. إذن يبقى خطاب الرموز الدينية والميليشاوية أكثر تأثير على العامة، سواء استخدم منبر المسجد أو الإعلام، مع أنهم الآن يستخدمون جميع هذه الأدوات، الإعلام والمسجد ومواقع التواصل الاجتماعي. عندما حرض عبد الملك الحوثي على الصحفيين والسياسيين كان ولا يزال رد عناصر الميليشيا حملة اختطافات واستهداف للصحفيين والناشطين. وعندما حرض الشيخ عبد الله العديني على فيلم 10 أيام قبل الزفة وقبله على المقاهي التي يختلط فيها الشباب والفتيات في تعز، كان أن أعلنت إدارة الفيلم الاعتذار عن عرضه لعدة مرات، وأرجعت السبب في بيانها لحملة الترهيب التي شنها عضو مجلس النواب عن حزب الإصلاح عبد الله العديني بعد وصفه الفيلم بالمنكر. الفيلم طبعا عرض في أكثر من دول عربية وعالمية، وللأسف عرض أيضا في السعودية لكنه لم يعرض في تعز. كما تم الاعتداء على المقاهي والعمال الذين في المقاهي بعد أن حرض عبد الله العديني على تلك المقاهي. عندما حرض السلفي هاني بن بريك على أبناء المحافظات الشمالية، وأساسا كانت هناك حملة تحريض من بعض الصحفيين والمثقفين من أبناء المحافظات الجنوبية، خصوصا بعد مقتل أبو اليمامة والذي أصلا عبد الملك الحوثي أعلن أنه استهدفه، كان الرد باستهداف محلات أبناء هذه المحافظات والاعتداء عليهم وترحيل العشرات من العمال ومعاملتهم كالحيوانات. سأتحدث قليلا عن العنصرية تجاه المرأة. لا أعرف إن كانت بقية الدول العربية تعاني من نفس المشكلة. طبعا يختلفون الجميع في كل شيء، المتحاربون يختلفون في كل شيء إلا في طريقة استهداف المرأة، تحريض المجتمع عليهن، تكفيرهن، التركيز على الحياة الخاصة لهن، شكلهن، لبسهن، تلفيق تهم أخلاقية، تشويههن والتشهير بهن. أنا أعتذر عن بعض المصطلحات التي سأوردها هنا لكنها في الواقع ولا أستطيع أن أجمل الواقع. إذا كانت ليست متزوجة فهي عاهرة تبحث عن زوج، وإن كانت أرملة أو مطلقة فالكلام أسوأ، ولو كانت متزوجة يشتم زوجها ويوصف بالديوث الذي يرضى على عرضه، يتم دبلجة الصور وفتاوى إهدار الدم. منذ سنوات أنا شخصياً أتعرض لهذا الخطاب: الملحدة، الكافرة، الاشتراكية، العلمانية التي ترتاد المراقص والبارات، العاهرة، وطبعاً تحت هذا المصطلح تندرج كثير من المصطلحات الشعبية التي تحط من كرامة المرأة: العانس، القبيحة، السوداء، طبعاً هذا أنا، والعجوز الشنطاء. المرأة جسدها وشكلها ولبسها، تنتقد المرأة لشكلها ولبسها وجسد وليس لعملها. وحتى التهديدات، أحدهم أرسل لي وهو صحفي طبعا ينتمي لإحدى الجماعات الدينية: سنغتصبك في الشارع ولن تجدي من ينقذك. وآخر ينتمي لجماعة دينية أخرى وهو صحفي أيضا قال لي: أنت تنتقدين جماعتنا، يبدو أن أحدهم قد خدعك. طبعا فيه إيحاء جنسي. عندما تتعرض صحفية أو سياسية أو ناشطة للمضايقات يكون الرد: لماذا خرجت بين الرجال ولماذا تزاحم الرجال مكانها البيت. سأعرض بعض الفيديوهات، وكما قلت هي شخصيات حقيقية وليست وهمية. أوكي. أنا ما أعرفش الأسماء. لا هذا لا.
إنه الجهاد ضد هؤلاء المجلس الانتقالي واجب. دمروهم، قدروهم، اضرب يا حوثي على تجمعاتهم، اقتل قادتهم، اذبحوهم قبل أن يتكاثروا، اذبحوا قبل أن يدروا، اذبحوهم يا رجال، اذبحوهم وعلموهم من هو الرجل اليمني الصلاصي، اذبحوهم على لعنة الله عليهم، اذبحوهم الذي لا عندهم أخلاق ولا عندهم شرف. وكانت نسوانهم تذهب إلى الاشتراكيين للرقص وتقديم الرقص، ونحن حررناهم.
احنا اخذنا بالباص معاهم.
مش عارفة يعني الأسماء، لا بس سوري.
من خرج بيدعسوا راسه، اقسم بالله لا يسحبوا بها بغرزها لا فوق الباص. مش بعدها ضربوا العوائل، سحبوا العوائل، من ذا الحين كل واحد يضم حريمه، كل واحد يتنومس. يقولون لهم مرة ولا رجال يخرج في صنعاء ولا في غير صنعاء في المحافظات ذي تحت الصدر فيجي له لبج وعصد، ترجع يصيحوا يقولوا بيعتدوا على النساء، بيعتدوا على بعنا نسوان فوق 40 باص. يعني كشفت لكم قبل فيدعسوا والد والديها، أي واحدة تخرج فارغة بنت حرام.
ولا زالوا حتى اللحظة يساومون بما يسمى برنامج
هذا تحريض على المنظمات الدولية.
برنامج الغذاء العالمي أحد وسائل المخابرات والتسائس والصنائع وأحد وسائل المكر والخديعة التي تستخدمها الأمم المتحدة التي هي في الحقيقة في يد أمريكا وإسرائيل وبريطانيا وفرنسا لنا من كل جانب. وفي الحقيقة إنما هي عبارة عن دهاليز للمخابرات ورفع الإحداثيات. هذا كما جاءنا من الأخبار الموثوقة من غير الدولة، حتى من غير الدولة، ممن يعمل مع المنظمات هذه، حيث علم واطلع على إحداثيات موجودة في مكاتبهم تغذي سواء غرف عمليات العدوان بأماكن تواجد أنصار الله سواء في الحديدة أو في غيره. هذا ما تعمله ما يسمى بالمنظمات الإنسانية.
يقومون بأعمال تبشيرية من أجل نشر الديانة المسيحية بين أبنائنا، يريد أن ينشغل من المخالفات، وهي النقطة الثالثة.
أيها الإخوة، تحت
يا دكتورة
هذا صحفي أردني حرض على الشماليين
بأن مقتل أي شمالي اليوم في عدن هو ثأر لكل هؤلاء الشهداء الأبطال. الآن قبل قليل شاب جنوبي بطل يطعن شمالي في مطعم الشرق الأوسط في عدن. هكذا نريد الدم في الدم.
اوكي شكرا جزيلا سامية. رح اشوف بس اذا في I'm gonna check if there are any questions in the audience. If you have, I mean, we have a few minutes, so can you please raise your hand and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much to IFI and AGBU for this very important gathering. And a special thank you to Dr. Salma for speaking in the name of the Yazidi people whom I have been serving for the last 5 years. I have a question for all of the panelists this evening. At the very early stage of the invasion of Sinjar, we saw in Dabik, the English language publication of Daesh, as well as the multiple social media accounts of Daesh, as Dr. Salma explained to us this evening, that there was a call for extermination, and that the Yazidi were mushrikeen. And there were multiple fatwas and theological tenets that were proposed in these postulations on social media. My question is, how do we define in today's interconnected and digital world the collective responsibility that we all have to address genocide before it actually becomes genocide? In the case of the Yazidi specifically, I hate to say, but the evidence shows that we could have helped prevent or minimize the scope of genocide that ended up being conducted in Sinjar and the genocide that we are still dealing with today. Thank you.
I will take 2 more questions.
I'd like to address to Dr. Darina Abishdid concerning the Rwandan genocide. I recall way back when it took place, President Clinton actually mentioned the Rwandan genocide. He said that he knew about it, unfortunately, but nothing was done. So unfortunately, as the lady said, you know, how can we prevent? I mean, there, Clinton was the president of the United States then. There were other countries when Rwanda is more French, kind of a French colony, and none of those powers actually took immediate action. And so thousands and thousands of victims were, there. So how can you, genocide, but then what about those powers? What about those powers? They just turn a blind eye, and then they talk about genocide, and then how to help those victims, how to find new settlements for them, how to educate them, and how. But it's, the root has to, there the problem is also with those big powers. Thank you.
I just want to ask, why wasn't really the economic issue raised up as a main cause for discrimination? Remember, since man was born on this earth, people talked about the blue blood people. And this person is a blue blood, and the rest are the poor. So I think there are two basic causes for discrimination: economic and political. And political, internally, a leader wants to establish himself, reaches a post, seeks the weaknesses of a certain group, and he starts preaching against. And then there's the international politics that also leads to quite a bit of discrimination and leads to hate speech. So I think, in general, these are the two general causes. And of course, discrimination against women is very well, probably you don't know, but it's because women are much stronger than men. So men discriminate against them since Adam's day. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we, I'm not sure who would like to take the first question. How can we prevent genocide? I'm not sure if just given your experience, given that you were on the ground, do you think that at that moment when there was, the threat was always there. It was clear where ISIS was going to head next. And there was, warnings sent to the international community, and there was ways actually to prevent it. So in your experience, your interaction, do you think that on the ground there were certain states or parties that blocked that prevention?
ليس فقط في سنجار تحديدا، وأنا سأتحدث بشكل عام لأنه هذه تجربة ستكون، ليس أتحدث عن تجربة شخصية، وإنما هذا سيكون نموذج يدرس ويستفاد منه كعبر على الصعيد الأمني وعلى صعيد رجال الدين وعلى صعيد العالم الإنترنت وعالم اليوم. العالم هو قرية كونية في الحقيقة، لذلك هذا سيستفاد منها. الضحايا كثر حتى الآن، ليس فقط في سنجار، حتى الآن هناك ضحايا لا يزالون تحت الأنقاض. حتى هذه اللحظة هناك أطفال تحت الأنقاض. على كل حال ملتهيين بالحكومة هلأ بالعراق، بس بكيفية تأليف الحكومة. لكن ما أود أن أقوله، المشكلة ليست فقط بمجموعة تهدف إلى القتل والتدمير وارتكاب المجازر والإبادة الجماعية. المشكلة في من يغذي هذه الجماعات، ولماذا أصلاً تخلق هذه الجماعات، وما الهدف منها. طيب لماذا داعش حينما بدأ حمى الله جميع البلدان عربية وغير عربية، وهذا عمل أكثر من مدان ومستنكر، ولكن لماذا خلق داعش في سوريا وخلق في العراق وبعدها اليوم ذهب إلى عدن في الجنوب أيضاً القاعدة تحديدا هي أكثر من داعش هناك، ولكن في ليبيا من خلق هؤلاء ولماذا؟ وهنا نعود إلى التعقيب الذي تفضل به الأستاذ بأنه هناك عوامل سياسية واقتصادية تتحكم في هذه البلدان. يعني البعض يقول بأنه اسم داعش أصلا الدولة الإسلامية في العراق والشام هي لهذا مدلول لما كان يعرف عند العرب بالهلال الخصيب. لماذا خلقت في هذه الأرض؟ طب هل المشكلة النفط؟ طيب نحن سنواجه بعد فترة النفط. الآن بالأمس أعلن دونالد ترامب الرئيس الأمريكي أعلن صفقة القرن. هل سيتم استخراج النفط من لبنان قبل الحديث عن توطين الفلسطينيين تحديدا؟ لا أريد أن أذهب أبعد من الموضوع المخصص لنا لهذه الندوة أو هذا المؤتمر، ولكن هذا مرتبط بعوامل سياسية واقتصادية بمصالح دول. لذلك لا يمكن لي الحديث أن أقول لك تفعيل المواثيق الدولية. من وضع هذه المواثيق الدولية هو نفسه الذي غذى ومول وكان يعلم كيف يتحرك داعش. لذلك أشرت أنا في الحديث بأنه هل يعقل أكثر من 60 دولة لم تستطع أن تهزم داعش بين سوريا والعراق؟ هذا محط سؤال.
شكرا دكتور حاج. دكتور بشتيت.
I might say that, you're right. In fact, impunity is not anymore a problem since World War II. We know very well that now we can judge heads of states for crimes committed during wars or during peace. Also, another point is that if you look at the system of the international criminal law, we have tribunals, we have the permanent and the ad hoc tribunals, but unfortunately, we are always waiting under genocide and all these acts finish, and then we judge the perpetrators and the criminals. The question is how we can prevent this. We have in international law many principles. We have the principle to interfere when there is a humanitarian crisis. We have the principle of the responsibility to protect. All these should be respected by states. But unfortunately, political calculations and all these things go, so they dominate all these things. This is what I can say.
Thank you, Dr. Abishid. Dr. Haasvelt, would you like to maybe counter or explain more about the root causes of discrimination?
No, I don't want to counter, but I mean, it's the question, how can we prevent genocide is very popular to raise. It is much more difficult to get an answer. If not, it's not only something like a moral account or so on. Because because there are too many factors coming together. As long as there is not a strong, unified international will, which is, you can always observe that. In the Armenian case, and even also in the present cases, that there's no international will, then things happen like they happen. And if there is not enough information, what happens on the ground, that means also an understanding of what happens in these respective countries, and these respective countries are very different countries. Then it's not easy to mark the point when you say there must be an intervention. But what is an intervention? That is the next question. What can be as an intervention that makes sense? Probably, in the case of Rwanda, it would have made sense if the United Nations would have acted a bit earlier and a bit more robust and with a strong will. And if the French government would not too long have hesitated because of Francophone policies in Africa. And this is really, there's much guilt about this in countries which you can name. As to Iraq, I mean, where will you start? I mean, probably you would, as a historian, looking back in 10, 20 years, or maybe already now, you can say all started with the 2003 invasion of the Americans and the so-called accomplished mission of George W. Bush. But there was no mission accomplished, as we know. And take the Yazidi case. There's something else. I mean, this is also important. Nobody in Europe, not even in my country, where we have quite a numerable Yazidi community, people knew anything about Yazidis. I mean, they just were put on the public opinion when they were victims, victimized, and things had already happened. And so I will say there's no real recipe for this, but I think it's many of it's a question of information. It's a question, but it's more the question to work on international institutions and the unification of international will. In many cases, we have the institutions, but not the will. I mean, this is also a problem.
Thank you, and very much on point. Do you have any other questions? Okay. So thank you so much for all the speakers, who many have flown to Beirut. And thank you all for being with us. There is the next panel, which will focus more on social media. And we'll have two panelists as well who are going to engage in a discussion. So I hope you will continue to watch. Thanks. 1 minute. Okay, so our next panel is actually a very interesting discussion. It's about social media, and which has basically shaped our world and definitely shaped the work that I do on Syria. Without social media, there's no way to be able to document human rights violations in closed countries. Okay. So to begin with, like a very brief introduction for people like me who don't know a lot about this, social media and tech and digital security, etc. Social media was created for as a platform where people, but also civil society organizations, to be able to connect, to mobilize online and offline, to communicate with this specific objective of influencing political structures and social structures. And unfortunately, we live in a region where governments are not allowing civil society and people to do that. Of course, that varies between one country to another, but we have an extreme where in the Gulf and in Syria, for instance, where freedom of expression online is completely non-existent. Not because social media platforms prohibit it, but it's because the government completely blocks it. And we have somewhere in between, like in Lebanon and maybe in Iraq as well, where people are able to express their opinion online. Yeah, so we're in Lebanon and Iraq where we are able to express our opinion online, on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and somehow, like Aya was describing, that there's some form of toleration until you hit a specific nerve and then you're either detained or something, happens, or kidnapped, like in Iraq. Without taking much more longer, because they have more interesting discussion, so 2 questions. I mean, how can we protect online spaces in the Arab region? And what is needed to ensure the protection of freedom of expression and, the prohibition of incitement to hatred and genocide on social media? We will begin with Muhammad. Muhammad Najm is the executive director of SMEX, an organization that promotes and defends digital freedoms and rights in Lebanon and across the Arab-speaking countries. He is an expert on internet policy-related issues, and his work includes local and regional advocacy, campaigns, research on privacy, data protection, and freedom of expression. Also, Muhammad has organized the Bread and Net, which is the first digital rights events in the region that tackles topics related to technology and human rights and has become extremely popular. Muhammad, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, AGBU, for the invitation and for IFI. I'm going to start talking about the traditional space that we live in terms of like civic space. So basically, when we look at the civic space as it exists, we look at it from an angle that there's only one thing that actually can control the space, which is the state itself, الدولة. And when we look at, for example, here when people go to protest, when we went to public spaces, when we have dispute with the cops, everything that exists is actually, there is laws, local laws that being implemented on all of us. Whether we agree with them or not, that's another discussion. When we come to the online space, the dynamic changed in the last 10, 15 years because we have a big elephant in the room, which is the tech companies. We have companies like Google, we have companies like Microsoft, Facebook, of course, Twitter, Instagram, there's like tens or hundreds, and even Uber and others, Netflix. All these companies are controlling the space now, and they are sharing this power with the states. But it's really not yet organized, and this is the interesting part, because if we look at each company has different relationship with governments. Some of them are being invested by government. For example, Twitter, 1% of it is owned by Walid bin Talal. Uber, Saudi Arabia invested billions of dollars in it. So we look at many tech companies, there's this dynamic that we as users or experts or individuals are trying to understand. So the civic space online is still a space that is under-investigated. It's still a space that the dynamic always change day to day. There's always issues happening, and we need to keep following it. We need to always talk to companies. We need always to follow what's happening to understand the dynamics. For example, since there was a lot of discussion about hate speech, if we look at the hate speech as a topic, we cannot really look at it as like one thing, hate speech or no hate speech. There's really a lot of anecdotes, there's really a lot of details, even within this context. Because there's the speech that we hate, but we need to tolerate. This is something that we need to look at. And there's speech that we need to understand that this should not pass because it might lead to some kind of like violence or something. In the online space, in the last 10 years, let's say, or let's say after Arab Spring, after 2011, we have seen Arab state, I'm gonna talk mainly about the MENA region, we have seen tens of laws that's been regulated. So the online space before the Arab Spring was this kind of like free space. After the Arab Spring, we have seen tens of laws that came on the table, especially from Gulf countries, and everyone else is following the Gulf countries, the Gulf model. Laws around anti-terrorism, laws around also hate speech, cybercrime, all these laws. If we look at the spirit of these laws, or like the DNA of these laws, all the laws are actually protective for the state and the state actors, and the victims usually are the individuals. So if we look at the checks and balances, the powerless people are the people who will have these laws applied on them. And the people in the state or the state actor are the people who are not included in these laws. So these laws are created and are being applied in the last 10 years to enforce, to give power to the power people, to people in power, and to take power from the underprivileged people and communities. And this is really one of the main issues that we live within now. Of course, adding to this layer is the tech companies as well. So there's a lot of things happening in the region. There's algorithms that's being applied on us that lead to content removal. There's a Twitter that we read recently that there's a Saudi employee that turned into a Saudi spy to the Saudi regime, and he's now detained in the US. We have seen Netflix and other companies removing content because it's not respectful of local laws. We have seen Uber refusing to give data to the Egyptian government, and then they gave the data after. We look at the future of technology in this region, and it's actually scary because we are moving towards smart cities, we are moving towards digital ID, we are moving to fridge talking to the ACs, we are moving to the car, smart cars. Like there's all these technologies that are taking more and more of our life, and without the basic protection of human rights, I think we're moving into like a really dark area in our region. And I will stop here, and I'd like to open a conversation about this.
Thanks, Mohammed. Just a very quick question. So you've touched on two important, let's say, parties who are threatening our online security. I mean, on the one hand, you have the states who are passing laws that do not abide with international human rights law in any way. And then you have the other side, which are the tech companies. And in the previous panel, Alexei mentioned something very important, which is the role of civil society and how, like SMEX and others, they do a lot in terms of providing support to human rights defenders, activists, but also disseminating knowledge on how to, protect yourself from online attacks, basically, from the state and others. I mean, can you speak a bit more about the role of civil society in providing or in raising awareness? I mean, how, you are somehow the buffer between these unlawful laws and the tech companies attacking us and basically the normal people who are not exactly tech savvy to know how to protect themselves.
I mean, sure. I mean, as a civil society, this is our own mission, is to really protect the individuals, the underprivileged people. We started a hotline, for example, in the revolution in Lebanon, where we have like 150 or 200 cases so far reported. We try to help people. There's like detainee and police station where they have their phone taken from them, asked the police station, the general prosecutor asks the police station to take the passwords of the phones. So that opens the door a lot of, for example, that we don't have a privacy law in Lebanon. What we have now is something that protect users from companies, but it does not protect users from state and state actors in Lebanon. So this opens the door for us. Okay, we need to really think about how we can change this in policy. And we know policy in Lebanon takes really 10, 15 years to introduce a law. It's problematic. For the tech companies, we're always in touch with tech companies, but there's always a lot of context that need to be explained. We have seen a lot of content that's been removed because of the algorithm. We have seen content that's been removed because the sarcasm is not being understood well. We have seen content that's been removed for different reasons. So who hold the power are the companies, like the bottleneck of the decision is like the companies and the states. And we as civil society or organizations, like we try to understand all the dynamics and the context, and we try to help as much as we can. But there are things that we need to change by structure. We need to have better policies. We need to have more transparency from companies. And we also, of course, need to have more raising awareness for users, because I mean, something good that happened, and I'm not going to be very pessimistic here, like something good that happened in the since the revolution in Lebanon is like people are more aware about their privacy in Lebanon. We used to talk about these issues and we have really small audience responding to us. But now there's a lot of people are asking more and more, and this really education, it's a curve. And I see this is gonna help in the policy change in the next 3 to 5 or 10 years in the country, and that's something positive I see.
Thank you. Shahid, my question to you is, as Facebook being one of the main, I think it's still the biggest social media platform. I mean, how does Facebook take measures to protect users, but especially human rights defenders and activists, etc.? Before you start, I just want to introduce Shahid. Shahid Al-Hindi. She's a public policy manager at Facebook with a focus on human rights, working with government and civil society stakeholders in the MENA region. Shahid has a keen interest in content and safety issues and is working on understanding these issues in the region to develop more informed policies. Shahid previously specialized in corporate immigration law, providing immigration solutions to multinational companies and individuals, having worked in Europe and the Middle East, and she has performed immigration audits for Fortune 500 companies and overseen development of global programs for growing companies.
Thank you. In terms of what we're doing, I think we ought to start with the mission. So the mission of Facebook is to give power to people to build community. And is that better? Yeah. Yeah. So I'd want to start with the mission. So we recently changed our mission a couple of years back, and we said that we wanted to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. What do we mean by community? We mean meaningful communities. We want to help people find common ground. We want to engage users with new perspectives. We want them to become aware of different issues that they had no exposure to before. But the reason that it has to be meaningful is because exposure alone isn't enough. People have a need to identify with people who are different from themselves to adopt new perspectives. And what we're noticing on the platform is that, exactly as Muhammad said, the human rights defenders and other users are now using our platform to evaluate policies, train their peers, campaign on social issues, put victims in touch with support groups, film and document human rights abuses, research war crimes. Everything essentially that human rights defenders were doing offline is now online. That also means all the challenges of the world that we see offline are also online too now. So what Facebook has become really is a platform which is essential for freedom of expression. We are working in 6 out of the 10 of the most heavily censored countries. It takes a huge effort on a daily basis to keep content up and resist these traditional censorship techniques. And although I can't go into detail in terms of what we do on a day-to-day, because that would help people gamify the system, and we want to protect against that, some things that we do is work with people like Mohammed from SMEX. We work with civil society at large, and we speak to them to understand their issues and the issues that they're facing on the ground, and how these issues translate from the online world to the offline world. And specifically, we're interested into the potential for harm, which is quite relevant to what we're discussing today in terms of genocide and these grave human rights abuses. In terms of what we're doing, I think in our last transparency report from July till September, we removed 80% of all hate speech using AI. So, and that doesn't mean that it was automatically removed using AI, it meant that it was flagged to us. So out of all the hate speech that we actioned, 80% was actioned using AI. So AI is a key tool for trying to protect users on the ground. Pardon? Oh yeah, by AI I mean artificial intelligence. And we're creating these really high priority reporting channels for civil society to be able to get into contact with us and let us know about the things that are most dangerous on the ground, and we're providing them with 24/7 support. We're also creating carve-outs in our content moderation policies. So I'm not sure if any of you have seen our community standards. If you haven't, I strongly suggest you check them out. If you go on facebook.com/community standards, you'll find that a lot of what we've been talking about today in terms of hate speech, we go over and above our international obligations on where we draw the line on hate speech to try and prevent further abuses. Our challenge usually is not misalignment with the policy, but an issue of enforcement. And that's where we really face a challenge. So what we're doing to tackle the enforcement issue, we've doubled our numbers. We now have 30,000 people working on security and safety, and we're continuing to develop our knowledge in this area, and we're trying to act faster, we're trying to be closer to the ground. For example, in the crisis in Myanmar, not so long ago, we now have moderators and reviewers that speak Burmese, and they can review the content. We now have the language capabilities, and that was one of the issues that we fell short on last time, and we're still learning. So we now have a mechanism in place, and we do these human rights impact assessments, and they're helping us understand how to take all these preventative measures to help secure the rights of those on the ground, in addition to human rights defenders. If I could go off on a tangent, I just want to mention end-to-end encryption briefly. So end-to-end encryption is a very, very important topic, and it's what we're doing really to protect users, but it's super controversial because it means that we won't be able to access the data ourselves, and if we can't access the data, how will we protect our users? Which is why we're rolling out these human rights impact assessments globally to try and understand all the risks and be able to mitigate them ahead of our implementation of end-to-end encryption. Because I don't think anyone can say arbitrarily that end-to-end encryption is bad. We know they're super important for human rights defenders. They're important for children. They're important for millions of ordinary people operating on the ground in increasing state surveillance.
Maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions from the audience to give the chance maybe for the... Okay.
Hello, good evening. My question is concerning Facebook and its policy towards the denial of genocide, in particular what concerns the Armenian genocide. when you get on the platform, you'll find a lot of denialism when it concerns the Armenian genocide, which often translates into hate speech, as defined by our panelists earlier. My question is, in those terms, what does Facebook do to prevent such denialism and hate speech that often appears, not just in terms of posts, sometimes under comments that are placed below the posts themselves? What sort of steps does Facebook take? Because I don't think that, with all due respect, 30,000 people working on that, you may be working on larger issues, but when you go about it locally, and with all the problems that we have around the world nowadays, I don't think that AI and 30,000 people will be able to manage it. Thank you.
Mine is more like food for thought. Social media is a double-edged sword. Social media, that's great. At the same time, I have the impression there's a kind of an Orwellian state being created. George Orwell in his book 1984, Big Brother is watching us. So right now, whenever I just look at Facebook and so on, it's like Big Brother is watching us. It's yes, I express my own thoughts, but at the same time, there's Big Brother. Big Brother is watching me. So a kind of an Orwellian state. So I have the impression what George Orwell 70 years ago wrote. Presently, well, we're living actually in an Orwellian state.
So I just want to expand to what you're saying. I mean, I kind of agree with you. But also want to try to compare this to the real world now. We are now sitting in AUB, right? So we follow a private property rules. For example, no smoking on campus, right? But the moment you leave AUB, you're in what we call public space or like civic space. So you have actually the chance to go out and do something you like. Of course, the civic space follows to some extent the rules of the state, but sometimes it's not really obliged in a country like Lebanon, where most of us are kind of like libertarian here, like we do whatever we want. We can drink alcohol on the street, we can do things we can do even in the US. Looking at the internet and in the online space, there's actually no civic space. We go on Google, there's policies on Google. We go on Facebook, there's also policies on Facebook. We go on Twitter. We go from one platform to another, and we're actually in like a big mall where everything we do is, like you said, it's being surveilled. And there is specific rules that's been obliged here and obliged here and obliged here. And there's all these hidden dynamic of power that sometimes we know about, sometimes we don't know about. So this is the internet how it is now, but we need to think together, like what should we do about it?
Just before I jump to the gentleman's first question on the Orwellian state that you were discussing, it's a very interesting concept that you propose, but I think we do have our checks and balances, right? Obviously, that's how it feels, and that's perfectly normal. That's how people feel when they are subject to any form of rules. But I want to make it clear that we have checks and balances enforced. We have a transparency report. The data is encrypted. It's in data centers in countries where we know the rule of law will never allow for governments to abuse the data in those data centers. And I just want to make it clear, like if you have any particular concerns about the way that we treat data or what's happening, I'd love to discuss that with you. On the gentleman's first question on denial of genocide, I think you're absolutely right. I think this afternoon we heard a lot from everyone here about how denial can lead to much more severe consequences. But when it comes to us as a platform, we are not arbitrators of truth. And we rely on third-party fact checkers to fact check content. So if this content, for example, is becoming viral and there are a lot of people engaging with it, you can submit it to be fact-checked. We wouldn't fact-check it ourselves because then it really would be a George Orwell state. We would be deciding what's true and what's false. So we'd always want to step away from that role. But in terms of what we're doing to counter the negative measures that follow pieces of fake news or misinformation that hasn't been fact-checked, you can report any piece of content online. You can report everything from a post to a message to a comment. All these things can be reported. The other thing that I want to speak to you about is AI. I know you mentioned that you have doubts about AI and how far we can get it, but right now we're at 99.9% enforcing against terrorism, and that's as a result of AI. Now, we don't always get it right. Because we are enforcing at such a high rate, and a lot of this is before the content's even viewed by anyone else, that means we are making mistakes. And that's what we're solving to back correct. But when it comes to things like this, where I think we're looking at a different level of national security concern, we have to make sure we're taking the steps carefully and accurately. We can't afford to have mistakes when it comes to things like genocide. We can't afford to say, well, we enforced against everything. We've essentially shut down 5% of freedom of speech, but we'll correct for that later. Like, we'd hate to be put in that position.
So I just want to add to the policy discussion now that's happening between Shahad and the gentleman is that we need to know that Facebook is a US company, and actually what applies on this company is actually US laws and regulation. And this is also interesting that we live in Lebanon, we live anywhere in the globe, there's billions of users that actually what applies on them is US laws. And to go more in the Lebanese context, for example, and this is something I've seen and it existed from the beginning, is like, for example, if you support Hezbollah, for example, this cannot be like Hezbollah, they have no presence on Facebook because they're not allowed, considered as terrorist organization, as well as Hamas and other groups, even though, for example, they exist in the Lebanese parliament. So if you come to elections, there's this big chunk of political existence in Lebanon that are not allowed to exist on the platform, which give advantage and disadvantage to their allies or against their allies or to the supporters. But also to another layer of context, like we're discovering recently since the application of the algorithm of the AI, many people are receiving now notification that their content are being removed for posts from like 5 or 7 years ago because they have Al-Manar existed, or like Hezbollah, or like Nasrallah, or like any kind of keywords that Facebook probably have fed in the platform or in this giant algorithm. So this is also an effect of freedom of expression in the country. Whatever your opinion is about Hezbollah, you like them or you don't like them, this is your personal choice, but like they exist as a political party. They exist, they're huge as well. So not having them on this platform is also disadvantage to the freedom of expression, in my opinion. So yes, so all these policy discussions are really important to make the policies as contextual as possible to our region and to the country.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions. Yes.
I will ask my question in Arabic. سؤالي لمحمد من خلال خبرتك ورصدك قد ايه لعبت وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي دور بالثورة؟ وهل كان في قيود عليها للبلاتفورم والمنصات خصوصا تويتر؟ لاحظنا انه تويتر لغي كثير حسابات اثناء الثوره والبوستات اللي عم تنزل، في شي معلومات معينه؟ والسؤال الثاني لشاهد، قد ايه الذكاء الاصطناعي بدير فيسبوك وقد ايه العقل البشري بدير فيسبوك؟ شكرا.
بدنا ناخذ بعد سؤال واحد please.
I will just ask a very simple question. What's the future of all this information? All this information in the media. Information, yes. That is collected. Okay, that is collected in the media. What's the future? What's the future? Will it all be kept or will it be thrown away? What will the future be of all this information collected in the media?
Shahad, you want to start with the answer? Okay.
So the question regarding how much humans versus AI, we have offices all around the world, so I think we definitely rely a lot on humans. We rely on humans for design. We rely on humans to come up with the policies. For example, when we create our community standards, when we decided what would be our standard for hate speech, we liaise with civil society, we reached out to them, we take in their thoughts, and we essentially do a massive research project before any type of policies implemented. So in terms of how much human involvement we have tons of human involvement. I think where we rely on AI is on enforcement, and that's because of a lack of reporting. We don't receive a lot of reports in this region specifically, and as well in some of sub-Saharan Africa. We have a problem with reporting, which means that we don't see the most offensive content requiring immediate action first. And that's very problematic, which is why we've had to come up with other mechanisms to be able to rely on AI and help us make the platform safer.
So you asked about future of information on media or on social media? Social media, okay. Yeah, okay. So basically, when we use social media, when we use the internet actually track us in everything we do. Like everything we click on, everything we search, everything we like. So what exists online is actually another persona for us. So basically, if you're looking at lingerie or at cars, there's this persona that really like cars, check the box, or like vitamins, or like everything. So all this collection of data, or your age, or your sex, or your behavior, or everything, orientation. So everything that's collected about you, the internet, the web start feeding you ads with things that you have in mind. And they start expecting what is your persona in the future, and they start letting you know about things. So they take you in a path that might actually change your reality of a person to something else that you're probably not. So it is scary if you really engage with the web without actually trying to avoid the tracking. So basically, we really advise people that not to use everything and try to tell the browsers not to track them, because this is really important. I mean, this is half of the question that you ask. The other half is everything that's been done on social media has been collected. Everything, and that's the business model of the web, unfortunately. Like, that's how they make money, by selling, like when we use Facebook for free, or Twitter for free, or Google for free, it's actually not for free. We are the product. They sell us things. I mean, Facebook now have $50 billion that they don't know what to do with. So they have a lot of, like, they collect a lot of money. The companies, the tech companies, collect a lot of money. So I hope they come and invest in Lebanon, for example, to take us out of the economic crisis. But I advise against it, of course. So there's all this collection of data, and that is the business model of the tech companies. And I mean, the future is more collection. The future is, now people are talking about it. Now people are trying to say, okay, we really want to have another model of the internet, because this model is broken. This model is wrong. This model is really unethical. And as much as the company tried to fix it, it's really broken by design, because that's how all these companies started. If you want to fix a building and the building is tilted, you cannot fix the second and the third floor. You need to fix the building, the basement of the building again. And to do that, you need to actually, in my opinion, deconstruct all these companies and build it again in a way that is open, transparent, don't collect data, and being really for social good. And maybe do it as a ta'awniya, like a collective, and make it as open source as possible, and make it owned by people. I mean, this is one way of thinking of tech companies, how to move forward. But unfortunately, we have people who want to have more power, want to have more money, want to do all that. I mean, that's kind of philosophical question. I mean, there's a lot of schools about this. We can talk about this hours and hours. So, yes, please.
Yes, so I just wanted to add to Mohammed's answer. So yesterday was World Privacy Day. Yes. So it's very, very exciting. So what we've done on our
and also Nabih Berri's birthday.
So what we've done is we have, I think this is the biggest platform we've ever had to be able to push out privacy tips in general. So we're pushing out privacy tips across the board. Because we have 2.7 billion users, we are sending everyone a prompt the minute that they log into the platform, and this prompt will direct them to our new security checkup. So we had a privacy checkup before, but we've rebranded it now, and it's a lot easier to use. So it's a couple of simple steps, and you can check all the data that people can view online about you. The other part that we announced yesterday as well is our off Facebook data. So if you go into your security settings and you go to off Facebook data, you can actually remove any data that we collect on you, which means you won't see personalized ads anymore. So that option's available if you do so wish to choose it.
And to answer the Twitter question, many people don't know this, but Twitter is a much smaller company than Facebook. It's really small in terms of like how many people they have. They really don't make enough money as Facebook. Like basically 2 or 3 years ago, they started making money, Twitter. So they're really new to the expansion, to security and safety. They are trying, but there was also an issue that happened in the revolution in Lebanon when people are asking for their security, or like there's some security question, or like the SMS was not received. There was a lot of people who lost access to their account. We helped in this. We were in touch with Twitter. We collected all the username who has problem, and it was fixed. There was a bug in the system. I mean, technology. We need to understand that technology most of the time doesn't work. For example, why it's really hot here? Because it's really very technical room, and the computer is broken, so that's why it's really hot. So like technology most of the time doesn't work. So really, if there's no need to build technologies, don't build it in the first place. Use analogs. I really like analogs. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes, I just want to thank Mohammed and Shahid for the very interesting discussion, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. I think one takeaway from today's conference is we're still very, very far away from having local laws that abide or meet international standards, whether to protect people from genocide, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and basically criminalizing speech, hate speech. Sorry. Thank you so much. We have a reception at the room to the